Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles Stories of the Supernatural. And I hope you enjoy this new show, whether you're viewing it on the internet or listening to a podcast version of the episode. I do want to thank you for being part of my audience. You can also find links to videos or podcasts on MiamiGhostChronicles.com, as well as where you can submit your story about any eerie experiences you've had, which I would love to hear about. Just go to the Submit Your Story tab. Please subscribe to our channel so that you receive notification of when we release a new show. And find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. This is where I usually live stream and where I give you a behind-the-scenes look at locations where new episodes are being filmed at. I also tell you about all the interesting guests that will be appearing soon on Stories of the Supernatural. I hope you enjoy the show, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles. How is everyone doing today? Good, I hope. Let me tell you, I gotta talk about this real quick. Usually I'm doing great, but you know where I live, I've got a well on my house. That's how I get my water. And for some reason, a couple of days ago after a power outage, my well decided not to work again after my power came back. I'm telling you, it's been the longest 72 hours. There's nothing like having no water in your house to go, oh, I'm such a crybaby. I admit it, I am a crybaby. But anyway, guys, let me get to the really important stuff, which is the fantastic guest that I have today. And this is a gentleman by the name of Mark Spencer. And he is the author of the nonfiction novel A Haunted Love Story, and also the novels Ghost Walking, The Masked Demon, The Weird Motel, and Love and Reruns in Adams County. Okay, he also has collections of short stories, and he has over 100 novellas, short stories, and articles that have appeared in national and international magazines. He's received numerous prizes and awards recognizing his work, and he you might have maybe even seen him probably on TV because he's appeared on some of the paranormal shows talking about a very interesting and tragic story about where he lives, which is a certain house in Monticello. But anyway, let me bring Mark on and we can talk about that a little bit more. But anyway, how are you doing today, Mark?
Oh, I'm fine.
Fantastic. I am so glad to have you on. It's a pleasure for me. And I'm going to ask you, Mark, what I ask all my guests, which is prior to you moving into this house where you had these paranormal encounters or experiences, did you ever have a brush with the paranormal prior to this?
No, it's a pretty easy question for me to answer. Before moving into the Allen House in Monticello, Arkansas, I was a pure skeptic. I thought people who talked about ghosts and other paranormal activities were people who had active imaginations.
Okay.
I didn't believe any of it. When my wife and I first moved to Monticello, and we told new friends and acquaintances that we were interested in the big old house or North Main Street, they would frequently tell us that we didn't want to buy the house because it was haunted, and we would just laugh because we thought it was really funny that these people took the idea of a haunted house so seriously.
Right. In other words, that it was like you were thinking, okay, fine. That I imagine if it's going to get me a better price on the house, better so.
Right.
Yeah. And so obviously you bought the house
Mm-hmm.
and you move in. And I mean, I live myself in a 100-year-old house. It's an old wooden farmhouse. And I know that sometimes these houses, they make these unusual noises that just comes with the territory of having an older home.
Oh, sure.
Did that happen to you guys? And at what point did you start realizing that maybe it just wasn't coincidental?
Well, of course, there are lots of stories about the house. The house was already pretty well known before
Mm-hmm.
my wife and I ever heard about Monticello, Arkansas, or the Allen House.
Right.
There'd been write-ups in magazines and in newspapers, and there had been chapters in books going back 40 or 50 years, as a
Wow.
matter of fact. Since the 1950s, the Allen House had a reputation for paranormal activity. And I had grown up in an old house. I grew up in a house built during the Civil War, in fact,
Okay.
and so I knew that old houses made noises, and sometimes there were funny smells,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes the odd shapes of the rooms and the windows could create interesting things in terms of light and shadow.
Right.
So I was aware that there were a lot of natural explanations for what people interpreted as paranormal, and so I was pretty good at just rationalizing things.
Okay. And
Um, my wife and I moved into the house, and I actually right away some unusual things started happening. But I was pretty good at rationalizing
okay,
those
right. In
events.
other words, yeah, you're like thinking, and I imagine, and people don't realize sometimes that when you're moving into a place, sometimes you're so caught up in the process of moving and
Hmm.
that you almost you don't have time to pay attention or to really think about what it is that you're either hearing. And let me ask you, um, prior to you owning the house, I mean, had it stood vacant or did you buy it directly from somebody that was living in it?
We bought it from a somewhat eccentric woman who was living there by herself.
Okay.
Um, we moved to town and we just fell in love with the house. We just thought it was a beautiful Victorian.
Mm-hmm.
Needed some work. We the house was not for sale,
Oh, okay.
but we did tell new friends and acquaintances around town that we loved that house and that we were interested in buying it if the person who owned it would ever be interested in selling it. We had
Okay.
actually gone to see a real estate agent about the house.
Okay.
We wanted the real estate agent to approach the owner and see whether she would be interested
Wow.
in looking at an offer, and the real estate agent wouldn't do it.
Really?
And she was very vague about her reasons for not approaching the owner. She merely told us that the house had a history, and she wanted to have it.
That's
And so
unusual
we
because
left.
usually real estate agents, if there's a way for them to make a commission, it's like, okay, what's the worst that could
Well,
happen? They say no, you know?
yeah, exactly. I told my wife, I said, well, I guess we moved to a town where real estate agents have no interest in
Exactly.
making money.
No ambition. What's
Uh,
wrong?
yeah. So we left the realtor's office and decided that we would maybe just approach the owner ourselves, and
Okay.
we did go to the house, but nobody was there. The woman we bought the house from was frequently gone on trips. She traveled a lot,
Okay.
but it's a small town. Word
Mm-hmm.
gets around. And one day, she called me at my office at the university and
Okay.
said, I understand you want to buy my house. And I said,
Wow.
well, would you consider selling your house? And she said, I might if I like you. And and then we arranged to see the inside of the house. She was about to leave on another trip, and so it was going to be about 3 weeks before we could get to see it. In the meantime, my wife and our kids gotten into the habit of driving by the house a lot.
Okay.
And one incident that occurred that was kind of interesting. This was a couple of days before we actually got to see the inside of the house. We all pulled up in front of the house in a car, and one of the kids in the back seat said, "Look, there's a lady in that window up there."
Are you
And I
kidding?
look and I see this lady, and it looks like a woman sitting at a desk, maybe reading or writing a letter. And we all saw her. My wife saw her. All three kids saw her.
Wow.
And my wife even said, we probably shouldn't sit here like this. She'll think we're
Right, she's gonna
stalking
think what's
her.
wrong with him. Why are they looking at me?
Yeah,
Oh
and
my
so we
God.
and so we drove away. No doubt that we had seen the owner sitting in the window. But then a couple of nights later, when my wife and I got to see the inside of the house, she took us up to the second floor and she opened the door of the room where the window was. It happened to be the master bedroom suite, as a matter
Uh-huh.
of fact, and we couldn't enter the room because it was full of boxes and furniture. The owner was using the room for storage,
Oh
and
my.
she apologized that we couldn't get inside the room. And I said, "But we saw you in the window the other night." And she said, "No, no, that wasn't me." you know?
Okay, now let me. And at that point, she didn't fess up to anything. All she was saying was, "It wasn't me." So it's like, make of it what you will, but it wasn't
Well,
me.
and I was a little bit insistent for very briefly. I said, but we all saw somebody in the window, and she said, I
Right,
wasn't even home. I wasn't even home the other night, and nobody else lives here. And as you can see, you can't even get to that window. And I said,
right,
oh, okay. And I just let it go. I dropped it.
right.
She
Because you're
said,
thinking, I want her
have
to like me, so she'll sell me this house.
Right. I'm trying to ingratiate myself with this
Exactly.
lady because I want her to sell me her house. So I wasn't going to say anything more about it. And then she said, have people been telling you that the house is haunted? And I said, yeah, I've been hearing those stories. I said dismissively, I was
Right.
like,
And
oh,
let me ask you,
no.
did she ever confide to you, or did she think that's
Well,
going to kill my
yeah.
sale?
No, actually, as soon as I said that, yeah, I'd been hearing, or we'd been hearing from several people in town that the house was haunted, But I let her know that, I didn't take it seriously. Then she immediately said, "Oh, but it is haunted."
Oh, okay. So she was
And then,
truthful.
yeah, and then she proceeded to tell me and my wife about some of her own personal experiences in the house, especially when she first moved in. She said that when she first moved into the house, the spirits talked to her a lot, and it really bothered her, and she wanted them to shut up.
Oh my.
and, and so she performed some rituals with holy water,
Right.
and I'm thinking this lady's nuts.
Right. And you're like, okay,
But
but
I'm
just,
not saying that. I'm being
well, of
nice to her.
course, you're like,
Oh,
okay,
really?
just,
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, that's really interesting. That's fascinating. And she said that she got them to quiet down and that they didn't talk too much anymore.
you know
you
what? But
know,
it's, you have to give it to her. She didn't chase her out. She didn't, she like, I don't know how long did she live there for a
she
while?
was there 9 or 10 years.
That's pretty long. That's decent. She just
Yeah.
stood her ground, I guess. It was like, shut up.
Yeah, I didn't. She wasn't afraid of the spirit.
Mm-hmm.
She just was found them kind of annoying when they started talking to her. you
It's
know?
like, okay, it's very pragmatic about it. It's like, okay, well, this is my house and I'm living here now, so be quiet.
Right. And anyway, it was a long, drawn-out process in terms of buying the house. It was almost 2 years before we actually got to move into the house.
2 years?
Oh
Oh
yeah.
wow.
Well, we kept having closings because we did come to a price, and she actually didn't want a whole lot of money for the house. Not nearly
Okay.
as much as I thought she would want. And so we signed a contract, and I gave her earnest money, and then we were going to close, and she canceled the closing, and then she kept canceling the closing, and she probably canceled 9 or 10 closing dates.
Wow.
She always had one excuse or another. She wasn't finished packing, or she didn't feel well. And what it was she was having a really difficult time letting go of the house.
That's what I was about to say. That sounds like there's something else like going on with her as far as her attachment to that house.
Yeah. When we finally did move into the house, she couldn't leave town. She had 4 moving vans full of her stuff
Wow.
because she had a lot of stuff. It's a big house, and she had a lot of stuff. Uh, and she had those 4 moving vans parked in the lot of a motel just on the edge of town, and she stayed in that motel for 3 weeks because
Wait.
she couldn't leave town. And then she
That
started telling people that we had
is
stolen the house
really
from her.
unusual. You know what? Because, and what, was she was moving out of the town? Is that it, as far as where she was going to?
Yeah, she was moving to the Gulf Coast of Texas.
Okay, yeah. See, most people, when they're moving, they're like, they hit the road. It's like, I'm out of here. Bye. Whatever. I got stuff to do. Yeah, there
Yeah.
was something going on there.
Yeah, she just, well, as I said at the beginning, she was rather eccentric, and for
Okay.
one thing, she was a hoarder.
I was about to,
Um,
you just took the words right out of my mouth. I said, you know what? That's a lot of stuff because, when people move, you either
yeah,
leave or go, you get rid of stuff because you finally go through your stuff and you get rid of your junk. But that's a lot of stuff that she was, yeah, that's a hoarding thing. Yeah.
yeah.
So,
When she wasn't traveling and buying things, she
hmm.
was sitting in a home watching the shopping channel, and that's
Oh
how she
my
spent her
God.
time. She didn't have a job. She just lived off her. I don't know. She had money from a couple of ex-husbands, and she just watched the shopping channel when she was at home and ordered
Probably,
things.
I imagine three
Ev-
quarters of that stuff in those trucks was unopened, probably.
Well, there was a lot of yeah, there were a lot of unopened boxes,
Hmm.
and she was a rich hoarder. She had money, so she had nice
Right.
things.
She wasn't
Uh,
going through trash cans, in other words.
no, it's not like these people you see on TV. They have
Hmm.
30,000 empty milk cartons piled up in
Yeah.
their living room. She had nice furniture, nice paintings, prints, art prints, mirrors, knickknacks,
They
but
probably. That
things
shopping
were
channel, when she
stacked.
called in, they were like, here she is again.
Oh yeah, yes, and she had stuff stacked floor to ceiling.
Wow.
We really didn't have a good idea of the condition of the interior of the house until she finally moved out.
Well, you know what? I was about to ask you that when I know, like you said, that you got to go inside, and then of course you had all these delays with your closing. But it sounds
Hmm.
like if you go into a room and it's stacked with stuff, like how could you really find out what's there, what's not there, if there's
Uh,
anything wrong? It was like, so I bet you got a few surprises then after you moved in, huh?
yeah, the house wasn't in nearly as good a shape inside as
Yeah.
we thought it was.
Hmm.
It didn't look too bad because, as I said, she had nice things. She just had an overabundance of them.
Right.
And so she had lots of expensive glittery objects, and the walls were just totally covered with art prints and paintings and mirrors.
Hmm.
Uh, and so we really couldn't see what the walls looked like.
Right.
After she moved out, we realized that the house was going to be a lot more work than we had
So in
thought.
other words, you're telling me you had, like, that like that movie from the 80s, The Money Pit,
Oh
where
yeah.
after the old owner moves away, you're like, oh, and that's the thing that I imagine, there's only, I mean, even as handy as you are, sometimes you got to invest money to have people to come in to do work for you in some of these houses you know,
Oh
to,
yeah.
to live
Yeah,
there.
about 10 days after we moved in, my wife's sister and brother-in-law came to visit, and the first thing her brother-in-law said when he walked into the house was, "How long was this place abandoned?"
Oh my God.
So that gives you an idea of what it looked like.
Right. Yeah, once all the glittery stuff was gone.
Yeah, once all the glittery stuff was gone, it looked pretty rough. But we worked to get it fixed up. It was a lot of work, but it
So you finally
turned
had
out
your. You
okay.
guys, let me tell you something. Hats off. You guys, you really stuck to it. I mean, as far as
Mhm.
getting what you wanted, a lot of people, I imagine, would have thrown up their hands and said, "That's it. I'm done with this lady in the house. Forget it. I want it." But so it
Uh,
was meant to be. In other words, I guess is my point.
right. But after we finally got to move in, the first few days we were in the house, some strange things happened. You want to hear about those?
Oh yes.
Yeah, the day we were actually moving in, I was carrying boxes through the side door, and my son, who was 5 years old at the time, was standing by the back staircase, what they used to call a servant staircase, and
Mm-hmm.
he was just standing there, and I'm carrying these boxes, I'm trying to juggle these boxes, and I noticed him just standing there, and he looked a little bit pale, and I thought I kind of wondered whether he was feeling bad, and I walk in and I turn my back to him, and I'm getting these boxes situated, and I say over my shoulder to him, "Well, how do you like your new house?" And he doesn't answer me, and I get the boxes set, And then I turn, and he's not there. He's gone. And I thought,
Wow.
oh, that's strange.
Yeah.
And, he just disappeared, and he never said anything. And then about 20 or 30 minutes later, I went upstairs, and I found him watching a Star Wars movie. And I said, well, you okay? You didn't say anything when you're standing by the staircase downstairs. And he said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, about, just a few minutes ago, you're standing by the side staircase, and I asked you how you liked the house, and you didn't answer. And he said, I
Oh.
don't know what you're talking about, Dad. you know?
Oh my
And he
God, that's
said,
incredible.
yeah, and I said, oh, okay, not going to think about it. Not
It's
going to
like,
worry
yeah,
about
yeah,
it.
I gotta move stuff into the house, but I'll put that on the back shelf of like WTF. Okay, so
Yeah, and then a couple of days later, um, my little boy and I are in the kitchen, and we'd been in the kitchen for about a half hour that morning, and my wife comes in, and she looks at our son, and she says, "How did you get down here so fast?" And he just looks at her confused, and I said, "Well, Jacob's been down here with me for half hour." And she said, "No, I just saw him upstairs in the hallway." I said, "No, he's been right here with me."
right,
and,
so you were vouching for
and
him.
yeah, and then she kind of gasped and said, "Oh my God," you know. And then she proceeded to tell me about an incident that had happened the day before. She had been in the front entrance of the house in the front hallway, unpacking some boxes, and she said she'd seen Jacob go into the bathroom just off the entrance, close the door, and she had kept working there in the entrance with the boxes, and he'd never come out. And so finally she went to the door, she knocked on it, didn't get an answer, and she opened the door, and he wasn't in there. And
Oh,
so she's thinking, well, he just, came out when she had her back turned, and she didn't see him. So she went looking for him, found him upstairs in his room, and asked him whether he was feeling okay, and he said, well, why? And she said, well, because you were in the bathroom a long time. And he said, I wasn't in that bathroom downstairs. I don't go in that bathroom downstairs. It's too creepy.
oh my God. Now let me
He said,
ask you,
"Why?"
this is the, you only had what, one child at that time, or was it the same child that,
No, we had a couple of boys and a daughter.
okay,
But all the incidents I'm describing occurred with the one son,
the one
who
son,
was
okay, okay,
5 at the
all
time.
right, so, oh boy.
And 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 then something similar happened with my wife. She had a friend come over, and my wife opened the front door as soon as her friend came up. And her friend said, "How did you get down here so fast?" And my wife said, "Well, I was already down here." And the friend said, "Well, no, I just saw you upstairs in that window."
Oh
And
God,
my
the
wife said,
window.
"No, I've been down here for a while." And then the same friend was helping my wife a couple weeks later um, prepare for a yard sale, because the woman we bought the house from left all kinds of junk and
Uh-huh, I
stuff.
bet.
And so we decided, okay, we're gonna have a yard sale. We're gonna try to sell all this stuff. And my wife was in the back of the house tagging items, and her friend was carrying things into the front of the house. And my wife said she heard her friend talking to somebody. She was wondering who her friend was talking to because she wasn't aware that anybody else was in the house. But finally, the friend came to the back of the house and said, "Well, there you are again. Why didn't you come and help me?" And my wife said, "Well, what are you talking about?" And the friend said, "Well, you kept just standing there in the library staring, and I asked you to come and help me." And my wife said, "I haven't been standing in the library. I've been back here the whole time."
So whatever it is like, oh my God, that's incredible.
Well, it was a year before we had anything to do with paranormal investigators. We were bombarded with requests from paranormal investigators when we first moved into the house. The
Uh-huh.
first day we were in the house, we were getting emails and phone calls from people who wanted to come and do investigations. And we just said, no, we just bought this house as our private residence. We're
Right,
going to fix it up
exactly.
and live here. We're not really interested in, we don't have time to fool with paranormal investigations. but a year later, we did let the first paranormal group come in, and we told them about these incidents that occurred when we first moved into the house, and they told us that the incidents sounded like doppelganger activity,
Yeah.
where a spirit is pulling energy from a living person in the house
Mm-hmm.
and takes on the appearance or a very similar appearance to that
Right.
living person they're pulling energy from, which and there's a certain kind of logic to that
Mm-hmm.
I can accept. But yeah, there were various incidents over the course of the first year we were in the house. My wife said she heard things. Of course, my wife was at home every day, all day, and
Right.
and spend a lot more time there. And she said she'd hear these voices, and then on a couple of occasions she saw things.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, oh, my poor wife, she's,
Right. I know that
she's
usually.
at home, she's home alone too
Well,
much.
and you know what? I'm glad you brought that up, Mark, because everybody always thinks that all these hauntings and all these things only happen like at 3 a.m. And
Right?
not
They
really.
don't. No,
Sometimes you get
no.
this all the full thing in the middle of the day.
Yeah, yeah. I was at home sitting in our bedroom there reading one afternoon, a Sunday afternoon, middle of the afternoon, and my wife came into the room looking a little pale, and uh, and she said, "There's a man out in the hall," and I said, "Oh, really? There's a man out in the hall
Yeah, like how did he get
upstairs?"
there? As in like a real life
Yeah.
person. Yeah.
And I said, "Well, who is it?" And my wife said, "I think it's Jolie Allen." And I said, "Jolie Allen, the man who had the house built in 1906?" And
It's,
she said, "Yes."
wow.
I said, "Oh, okay." And I'm still a skeptic. Okay, I'm still
Right.
not really believing any of this, and I'm thinking, yeah, there's a rational explanation for this. There are toxic fumes coming up from the ground beneath this house or something, or there's something wrong with the electrical system. Yeah, something's going on, to make my wife crazy. That's
Right. And it's like, yeah,
what
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
thinking. But we were approached by Louisiana spirits um, in the late spring of 2008. We've been in the house almost a year, and they seemed like really down to earth, reasonable, scientific oriented paranormal investigators.
Okay.
They told us that they were mainly into debunking
Okay.
stories of haunting. And 98% of the investigations they did, they could find no evidence of anything. And in the 2% of cases when they did find something, it wasn't really evidence of paranormal activity, it was plain.
Okay.
And so we agreed to let them come in. They said they put no stock in subjective experiences. It was all as objective as possible. They used the technology available to try to discern things. And they really did try to explain why people might be thinking they were having paranormal experiences. And I thought this sounded pretty interesting, and I
Okay.
thought, okay, we'll let them do their paranormal investigation, and maybe they'll come up with some explanations. I honestly, at that point, still didn't think they would find any evidence of paranormal activity whatsoever. I thought they might find
Right,
some
but you're thinking, but
explanations.
they're going to
So,
be trying really hard to debunk this, which is great.
yeah, and so they showed up. I think it was in early June maybe of 2008, and they had all this equipment, and they set up. And my wife and I don't know the protocol for having a paranormal investigation
Mm-hmm.
in our house, and so we decided, well, we're going to go out to dinner, and then we're going to go to a movie, and we're going to let them have the house to themselves. And so we're leaving the house, and I say, okay, we're leaving. The house is all yours. And I remember feeling a kind of electrical charge in the air when I said that. And I really didn't think too much about it at the time, but I did feel something. I had
Okay.
a sense of something as we were leaving. And we get in the car and we drive down the street. We're only a couple of blocks from the house, and wife's cell phone rings, and it's the lead investigator saying that all the power has just gone out in the house.
Wow.
And so we turn around, we go back to the house, and the place is dark, and
You're like, what?
and we find out that they were just about to begin their investigation. The
Yeah.
lead investigator was literally in the process of saying, "Let's begin," when
Uh-huh.
a tree limb in the backyard broke off the tree and fell on the main power line and ripped the meter off the house.
You know what? You could say, I'm telling you, I call that paranormal sabotage because, yeah, you could say, yeah, I mean, nothing's impossible. Nothing is. But that timing is pretty incredible.
Yeah, well, and it was a warm early summer night. It wasn't raining. The wind wasn't
Uh-huh.
blowing. The tree wasn't dead.
Yeah,
It was a
exactly. It's
green
like,
leafy tree, and and in addition to the limb falling, just as they were about to begin, one of the members of the investigative team got a text, and this was back in the early days of texting,
mm-hmm.
and it came from an unknown number, and the text was, "I'm watching you."
Oh, God.
And she thought it was some guy back in Texas who was stalking her or
I was
something, and
about to say, that's like that movie,
she
The Stranger had the house. We're getting the phone call, but it's from the inside the house. It's like, what?
yeah, but it happened at the same time that the tree limb fell.
That's in,
And and so the investigators, they weren't able to do their investigation that night. They did have some battery operated digital audio recorders run in, but it took hours and hours to get the electric company to come out and
Let me
put the
ask something,
meter back
Mark.
in the
When
house.
when all this happened, did they think that it was paranormal, or were they just poo-pooing it as no, it's
No,
just
they
coincidentally bad
they
timing?
thought it was a coincidence. I thought it was a coincidence. I thought it was
Okay.
great though. I said, "Wow, we have a story to tell because it's a great coincidence." I didn't
Okay.
I didn't say to myself, "Oh, this is evidence of paranormal activity."
Right.
I was saying, "Wow, this is a great coincidence. It's a story."
It's like,
And I'm a writer. I've been writing short stories and novels for years, so
right.
I
I mean,
appreciate a good story.
that's it.
You
Let me
know?
tell you something. That's incredible manipulation, though, I'm sure, when you think of it, because, like you said, one of the things that sounds like they were is that they had a million gadgets which were, if not battery operated, were dependent
hmm
on electricity.
Yeah. Well, a couple of days after the aborted attempt at a paranormal investigation, one of the investigators called me and he said, "Well, we got something." And I said,
Wow.
"Well, you got something?" And he said, "Yeah, we got a couple of EVPs on the battery operated audio recorders. Um, the one EVP that was really compelling was captured on a recorder up in the hallway where they had their main station set up, and it was recorded right after the electricity went off, right after the tree limbs.
Okay.
You can hear the investigators talking, and and you hear one of the investigators actually saying, "That's a weird coincidence," you know.
Okay.
And you
Yeah.
hear an investigator say, "Well, I think a transformer blew." And then you hear this woman's voice, and it's not one of the investigators. It's of a distinctly different quality. It's
Uh-huh.
kind of whispery, and she says, "Not a transformer." And then she repeats that
Oh,
phrase two times, "Not a transformer." So she says "not a transformer" a total of three times, and that's the whole EVP. you
let me tell
know?
you something though. That talk about an intelligent response.
Yeah,
Sometimes you hear about
and
these EVPs that you're like, first of all, it's like, certain words that try to fit them into, like, but that's, oh, boy.
yeah. Well, and my reaction was, "Well, that's really interesting. I wonder how they faked that,"
It's like,
because I'm still skeptical. I'm thinking, well, one of the investigators must have said that. I'm still not ready to buy into it. But they did want to come back and do a full investigation, and so they came back about 3 weeks later, and my wife said she wasn't going to leave the house. She didn't want anything else broken.
yeah, it's like, I don't blame her.
And I said, "Okay." So we stayed, and nothing, nothing bad happened. No more tree limbs fell, and they were able to conduct their full investigation. And it was really interesting for me and my wife to kind of follow the investigators around and sit in on their EVP sessions and sit with them while they watched monitors and did all the usual paranormal investigative activities. And then a couple weeks after that, they came back to the house for the reveal.
Okay.
And the lead investigator, we all sat down in the dining room, and he had his laptop, and he opened up his laptop, and he said, "Before I show you anything, do you want to ask me what homeowners always want to ask?" And I said, "Well, I guess what do they always ask?" And he said, "Well, they always want to ask the question, is my house haunted?"
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Okay, so is my house haunted?" And he said, "Yes, definitely."
It's like, in other words, okay. That's incredible coming from a group
And
that you're telling me was always trying to debunk stuff.
right. And then he proceeded to play for us over 40 EVPs. They
What?
had recorded, he said it was unprecedented. He said they had
Oh
never
my God.
heard of any group recording so much activity. And they also had a couple of videos. They didn't have videos of any full-bodied apparitions or anything like that, but they had some funky-looking things on video,
Okay.
a couple of video clips. But the voices were really compelling. Over 20 of the 40 were what they called Category A EVPs.
Right,
These were
right.
very distinct, more than a single word. And there are different voices. It wasn't just the same voice.
Uh-huh.
There were at least 5 or 6 different voices. The EVPs were dominated by the voice of an adult woman.
Okay.
And then there was a voice of what sounded like an older woman, maybe an elderly woman. There were a few of what sounded like an older man, and there were several of what sounded like a young man. And then there were a couple of children's voices,
Wow.
and all the paranormal investigations that we've had since that first one, they've all recorded EVPs of the same voices.
That is incredible.
And
So it's
so
almost like, yeah, they're still
it's a
there, and it's
family, and my wife and I now we recognize the voices. We have, investigators will come in and go, "Oh, I got
wow.
this EVP. Let me play it for you." And I'll say, "Oh yeah, that's Jolie," or "No, that's Caddy."
So
That's
Mark, let me ask you
LaDell.
something.
you know.
After they play these EVPs for you, were you starting to become kind of a believer, or were you still holding out for?
I was getting
Okay.
very close.
All right.
I was getting very, very close.
Okay.
I remember sitting in my dining room with chills running up and down my spine,
Yeah.
and I said,
Okay.
where do these voices come from? Who are these people?" Because these
Right.
people are ghosts, And
Yes.
it's like, oh, okay. There was still that little corner of my brain, though, telling
Right.
me this couldn't be. I couldn't figure out why they would giving them money. They weren't giving me money. There wasn't. I didn't understand what the motivation would have been for them
Mm-hmm.
to fake these EVPs, but I still wasn't entirely convinced. And so, probably a couple weeks after that, I decided I was going to do my own EVP session.
Okay.
And I went up to the attic by myself one evening with a little like $10 digital audio recorder,
Uh-huh.
and I sat up there in the attic and I asked a few questions of LaDell, who's the main spirit. She's the one who dominates the EVPs at
Right.
least, and she's the woman who committed suicide in the house.
Right.
Um, and I just asked her a couple of questions, waited a few minutes. I wasn't very patient.
Well,
Asked her whether she liked it here at the house, and then I stopped the recorder and I played back what I had, and I heard myself, of course, asking questions, and then very distinctly, Liddell answered my question. She
wow.
said, "Yes, I like it here," and it was clear as day. I mean, it was very
And
clear
you
that
know
she
what?
wanted me to know that she was there and she was answering my question.
And you know what? Considering, because now you see that, like you said, they've got all these expensive equipment, by the way, recorders and this. And when
Hmm.
you're going to get it, you're going to get it even. when you've got, like you said, like you were probably thinking, I'm going to invest the minimum amount of money in something I'm not even sure I believe in, but let's
Right.
test the theory.
Oh yeah, we've had guests in the house record EVPs on their cell phones.
So yeah, yeah.
You
Like,
don't have to have anything fancy.
mm-hmm.
If you have real paranormal activity,
Exactly.
you're not going to have to invest much money. I can guarantee you that. At least not from my personal experience.
Yeah.
But that night in the attic, I'm there by myself. I knew I was by myself. There certainly wasn't a
Right.
woman sitting next to me, you know.
Right.
But her
Exactly.
voice was very distinct. It was clear that she was answering my question and wanted me to know that she was there. And that's the night I became a believer. I was 100% convinced. Up to that point, people in town would say, "Hey, is that house of yours still haunted?" And I would laugh and say, "Well,
Right.
no." You know,
Exactly.
after that night, when people would ask me whether my house was still haunted, I would say, "Yep, it sure is."
It's like, and I know it for sure it is.
Yeah.
And obviously, because LaDell was the one that committed suicide, was she always the ghost that was belonged to that house, or was there also sightings of another type of ghost besides her?
Well, going back decades in the sightings, people, previous owners, tenants, when the house was apartments, would most frequently see a female figure.
Okay.
And I'd say 70 to 75% of the EVPs are her voice.
Okay.
But if you go back and you read about the house, as it was written about in the 1960s,
Okay.
there was mention of LaDell's son, LaDell Bonner. And so going back to the first of the ghost stories that were told about the house,
Mm-hmm.
it was always believed that LaDell and her son both haunted
Okay.
the house. Her son died in 1944 at the age of 28.
Right. Okay.
And the attic had been a special play area and study area for him. And so the stories were that he haunted primarily the attic. And I think he actually haunts the whole house. He's actually
Okay.
all over
Because
the place.
what happened was, after she commits suicide, her family continued to live in the house for a while after that, or what happened?
Well, for a short time, yeah, she took mercury cyanide on Christmas night, 1948.
Mm-hmm.
Her mother, Caddy, was having her annual Christmas party, and so the house was full of guests. And LaDell mingled with the guests until late in the evening, when she took a plate of hors d'oeuvres and a glass of punch up to the master bedroom suite. And she used the punch and the hors d'oeuvres to mask the taste of mercury cyanide tablets.
Wow.
Um, why she did this, because LaDell was, had a reputation for being cheerful and much loved, and she was the kind of person you'd go to if you needed cheering up,
Okay.
ironically.
I know,
Um,
but by then her son had passed away, right?
right, her son had died about 5 years before. It had been
Okay.
almost 5 years
Okay.
since her son's death, and some people, of course, speculated that her suicide was connected in some way to her son's death.
Mm-hmm.
But I was always a little skeptical about that because of the gap in time.
Right.
Um, so
Yeah, because it was like what,
I don't
five
know,
years or 4 years, something like that, right?
5 years. It was only, yeah. He died in January of '44,
Okay.
so it was 4 years, 11 months.
Okay.
So that's a pretty good gap in time. Um,
Right. Like this was not like a fresh, that she did it
no,
right after he had passed away.
right, and she had led a pretty active life, and she appeared to have dealt with her son's death pretty well. Her younger sister Louie, died the same year, later in 1944, and
Oh.
her sister Louie left a daughter, Martha Jones, and LaDell became a sort of surrogate mother to
Okay.
Martha and
Okay.
Martha became a surrogate child to LaDell, and
Okay.
they became very close.
Okay.
And I think Martha's presence was a comfort to LaDell.
Exactly. As far as feeling needed and everything, sure, that's very understandable.
Hmm.
So, and go on with the story because I know that some people, but as far as something happened that prompted her was to commit
Well,
suicide.
nobody knew. People had their theories. They,
Mm-hmm.
about, oh, she was divorced, but she'd been divorced for 20 years,
Yeah,
so
it's
I
a long
never put
time.
any stock in that.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's
um,
like
she did have a soldier boyfriend during World War II, an
okay.
American soldier who was a guard at the Italian prisoner of war camp here in Monticello.
Okay.
But he had, and when the war ended in 1945, he had left, and that was the end of their wartime romance. Um, but again, there was that gap of time. It was a good three and
Mm-hmm.
a half year gap of time, and so I thought, well,
Right.
3.5 years, is she going to kill herself over her soldier
No. Yeah.
boyfriend
No, that
three and
doesn't
a half
sound
years later?
right. No, that doesn't
Um,
sound like a good motivator. I mean, because that's a pretty drastic step.
Yeah, so it was quite a mystery. Nobody really knew what her motivation for taking her own life was until one Saturday morning in August of 2009. I woke up and I immediately felt the compulsion to go to the attic.
Okay.
And I didn't understand the compulsion. I thought, well, did I just have a dream about the attic or something? Because I had
Right.
this
Right.
real strong compulsion to go to the attic. And it was like a voice in my head telling me that if I went to the attic, I was going to find something. And I resisted the compulsion because we had been living in the house for a couple of years by that point,
Mm-hmm.
and I had scoured the attic, and I found all sorts of fascinating little artifacts. But I really didn't think there was anything left in the attic for me to find. And
Okay.
it was a hot August morning, and I had
Yeah.
other things to do. So I went downstairs and had breakfast, but all through breakfast, it was like this voice nagging me, you've got to go to the attic.
Okay.
And so about a half hour after I'd been up that morning, I found myself going to the attic.
It's
And I
like,
didn't, and this is a big attic. This is what they call a grandmother's attic. It was a couple of thousand square feet.
wow.
And I didn't wander around the attic at all. I walked directly over to the edge of the south turret room,
Okay.
and I stood there looking down at a small 3-inch, 2.5-inch opening in the floor. And it's an old attic floor. There are lots of gaps in the floor,
Uh-huh.
places where things have been cut out, or places where the floor was just unfinished to begin with,
Right.
1906. And I stood there looking down at that narrow gap in the floor, wondering what I was doing.
That's a really small opening, let me tell you. I mean, as far as that, that's incredible.
Yeah, yeah, it's big enough to get your hand in,
Uh-huh.
and you could stick your hand through it and reach into the attic floor. I'd look down, it's kind of off to the side of the entrance to the south turret room, and I'd look down. I'd looked at that opening probably several times in the couple of years we've been in the house. I'd never seen anything inside the opening, never really gave a lot of thought to it. But as I'm standing there looking down at that opening, it was like that same voice saying, take a closer look. And I get down
Oh.
on my knees and I peer in, and at first I still don't see anything, but as I keep looking, I finally get a glimpse of a brown piece of paper. And my first thought was that it was old butcher paper because it was that dark brown.
Uh-huh.
And then right after that, I'm thinking, oh, it's old newspaper. It has to be old newspaper. Old newspaper that's turned brown like that.
Right.
So I'm not thinking of anything interesting because there's lots of old newspaper
Mm-hmm.
in
Right,
the
you're just
attic and under the floor and all. But I reach in to this gap in the floor. I get a couple of fingers on the edge of this brown piece of paper, and I pull it out. And to my surprise, it wasn't an old newspaper. It was an envelope. It was an
oh.
old brown envelope. not a great big envelope, but a fairly large envelope. And I opened the flap, and inside were a bunch of smaller envelopes. And these smaller white envelopes all had 3-cent stamps on them and were postmarked. And they were
Wow.
addressed to LaDell Bonner. And the dates on them were from October 1948. And I
Okay.
opened the flap on one of the white envelopes, and I pulled out the letter, and the salutation was dearest,
And you're like, oh,
and it was
good.
signed love, and then under the word love was the initial P, just P, nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that this was a love letter written to
Okay.
LaDell 2 months before she killed herself.
Wow.
And then I decided that I was probably dreaming and that it wasn't
I was
reality.
about to ask you, Mark, were you like
Yeah.
wigging out just about then going, okay, I just
Well, I was.
found the stash of letters out of this huge attic? I would have
Yeah,
been like,
it's the only time in my life when I've been fully awake, but I really thought I had to be dreaming.
wow.
People always have dreams in which they dream they're awake, and they
Ex-
dream that they wake up,
right,
but they're still
exactly.
dreaming. This was the opposite of that experience. And so I paused for for a few seconds, and then when I realized that this was really happening, that I was holding in my hand the love letter written to LaDell 2 months before her suicide, I I jumped up, I ran downstairs and got a claw hammer, I ran back onto the attic and I pried up the floorboard.
Okay.
And there under the floorboard were 83 letters from
Wow.
1948. Most of the letters, about 67 of the letters, were from this guy named Prentice, the P.
Okay.
Um, and then there were other letters. There were letters from friends of LaDell's as well. And then eventually, as I went through all the letters and envelopes, I discovered a long rough draft of a letter that LaDell herself had written, and some
Okay.
scraps of letters that LaDell had written.
So she was keeping
Um,
everything there. Okay.
yeah, and the guy's name was Prentice Hemingway Savage. So
Okay.
you couldn't come up with a better name for a romance novel.
Really, I was going to say, yes.
And Prentice and Liddell had actually grown up together in Monticello. They had run in the same social circles. His father was a doctor, and she was the pampered middle pretty daughter of the town's wealthiest entrepreneur.
Okay. So
And
yeah, they
they had dated as teenagers and young adults. And in fact, in February of 1913, Prentice had had his last date in Monticello with Liddell on the front
wow.
porch of the Allen house. And then she walked him to the train depot off the square and saw Texas, where he began his career in the oil business. He eventually became vice president of Texaco Oil.
Really?
Fast forward 35 years, and Prentice in March of 1948 is, ironically, I always thought it was interesting. It was the 10th of March, I believe. It was the same day that Zelda Fitzgerald died in a fire at an insane asylum.
Really?
Yeah. And anyway, Prentice was in Monticello visiting his elderly mother and some old friends, and somebody asked him whether he would be interested in going up to Hot Springs to the horse races with a group of Monticelonians. And he said, well, sure. Where are we going to meet to form a caravan to make this drive up to Hot Springs? And he was told the Allen House. And he was told that Liddell was back living at home with her mother,
Okay.
and that if he came along, he'd get to see Liddell, whom he hadn't seen in 35 years.
Okay.
And he said, well, sure. And then and as he walked up the walkway to the Allen house that day, he wondered whether Liddell would still be beautiful as she had been.
Right.
or whether she'd be old and wizened.
Right. Well, yeah, because what they had seen each other what as teenagers, or I mean, it was a
Yeah, since she was 19.
yeah, yes,
Um, and of course, to his delight, he discovered that she had not changed a bit. At least
okay,
that's what he told her.
right.
That she was as beautiful as ever. And of course, how do I know this? I know this because he wrote all about it in one of his letters.
Wow.
He was very reflective and reminiscent in his letters, and so the letters are really wonderful. And that he writes about his memories of growing up and his young adulthood and his memories
So he's like,
of
yeah, he's connecting
with
her, of course, to all
LaDell.
these wonderful memories.
Yeah, yeah. And so on that day in March of 1948, he and LaDell and some other folks went up to Hot Springs, and he and LaDell shared a raccoon dinner at the Horse Track Restaurant. And some of those sparks of their youthful romance were
Uh-huh.
still warm, apparently. And when he got back home the next Saturday in Minneapolis, Minnesota, he went
Okay.
into his secretary's office and he used his secretary's typewriter. He'd like to type his letters, which is really great because his handwriting
I
is really
imagine
awful. So
you
most
don't
of
have
the
to
letters he
decipher
wrote
handwriting.
typewritten. Yeah. He typed LaDell a letter telling her how much he enjoyed seeing her again after all the years, and how just what a wonderful reunion it was for him. And she wrote him back right away, and thus began their correspondence. And very quickly, they're flirting with each other in the
Oh,
letters,
of course.
and very quickly, they're they're making plans to see each other, to meet up
Okay.
somewhere, because he's an oil executive. He travels a lot.
Right.
She's the daughter of a wealthy entrepreneur. She travels a lot to go shopping
Right. And so he has a
over
perfect
the country.
excuse to absent himself from home, I take it.
Yeah, and so they're talking about meeting up in St. Louis or Chicago or New York or Louisville. There are all sorts of places where they might meet up.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with that because they're old friends. So there's nothing wrong with
Right.
old friends getting together.
Yes. Uh-huh. Yeah.
And
Okay.
in I think it was in late May or early June of 1948, um, Prentice mentioned that he was making a trip to Chicago, and LaDell said that she would join him there. And he got all excited. He got the nicest suite at the nicest hotel in
Right.
Chicago, and then she didn't show up. She couldn't make it.
Oh my God.
Um, and it's not clear exactly what came up or why she couldn't make it. I have a feeling her mother wanted to come along, and of course,
Right.
and so she had to make excuses and cancel the trip. And Prentice was pretty despondent about
Now let me ask you, Mark, how long
her
has she
not
been
showing
living
up.
with her parents? Was she, after she got a
She
divorce, she
was
had been living there ever since, or?
she'd been there about 8 years.
Okay.
She had moved back home about 1940,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
and in response to his disappointment and her disappointment too, Liddell was very
Mm-hmm.
disappointed. She came up with a scheme to see him and spend some time with him in July of 1948. She had a friend named Mary, and Mary's mother lived in Stillwater, Minnesota. And
Okay.
Liddell decided that she wanted to meet Mary's mother. She had heard so much about Mary's mother. She needed to meet Mary's
In
mother.
person.
And so she decided she needed about a month to go meet Mary's mother.
Right. It was
And
like,
so
man.
she took the train up to Minnesota, and Prentice met her, and Liddell did go visit Mary's mother one day, and Prentice went with her to meet Mary's mother,
Wow.
as a matter of fact, because one of the letters was from Mary's mother. And
Okay.
and and Mary's mother said, "Well, bring your gentleman friend back again, too.
Okay.
He was so charming, and it was so nice to meet him." And
So,
um, and so for about 3 weeks, LaDell and Prentice drove around Minnesota and Wisconsin and southern parts of Canada in his big Cadillac, stopped
Okay.
at resorts and tourist attractions and parks. And by the time he dropped her off at the train station in Milwaukee, on his birthday in late July, they were madly and passionately in love and totally committed to each other and promising to spend the rest of their lives together. LaDell returned to Monticello probably happier than she had been her whole adult life.
Okay.
She had had this fairy tale kind of childhood, but then her adulthood had been rather disappointing. She had had this bad marriage to
Mm-hmm.
a drinker and womanizer, and then she had the one son, and her son had died, her sister had died.
Right.
LaDell herself had become an alcoholic, so she had a drinking problem, which she hid pretty well.
So, but she was ready to be
Um,
happy. It's like, okay.
and she had had a lot of bad romantic relationships.
Okay.
She was always getting involved with the wrong kinds of men. One of her friends wrote to her about that. and,
Right. In other words,
and
she was
in
not
fact,
lucky in love, huh?
no, she wasn't. And her friend Frances in New England said she was so glad that LaDell had finally met somebody with whom she was compatible,
Okay.
meaning Prentice. Because Frances had always been worried about the kinds of men LaDell got herself
Yeah.
tied up with. You know,
Okay.
they just weren't right for her.
Yeah. In other words, they were
Um,
probably not trusting her judgment for a while. They were probably thinking, "Oh God."
yeah, so LaDelle was really happy, and she wrote to these three friends of hers about this relationship. That's when she revealed um, to these three friends. It was after she got back from the north. Um, she wrote to her friends and said, "I'm so happy, I'm in love," and that sort of thing. The only
Right.
problem, of course, was that Prentice was married.
I was about to say, I know there's got to be a fly in that ointment. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Now, to Prentice's credit, as soon as he got back home to Minneapolis, after spending all this time with LaDell, um, he broached the subject of divorce. In fact, he got home late at night, and
Wow.
he started talking with his wife immediately that night about
Wow.
divorce. And he wrote LaDell the next morning and said that he and his wife had stayed up all night, and he had been working on convincing his wife that they should divorce, that they hadn't been happy in a long time, and that she hadn't said much of anything, and he took that as acquiescence.
No. Okay.
Um, he was wrong, of course,
Yeah.
but initially he thought that it was going to be easy. He was going to move to the club downtown, the Gentlemen's Club,
Uh-huh.
downtown within a week, and he'd have a divorce within 10 business days because he and his wife didn't have any children, and it was just going to be easy sailing, he thought.
Okay.
Well, it didn't work out that way. His wife had the opportunity, of course, to give some thought to the matter and to
Mm.
see an attorney,
Yeah.
and she told Princess that she didn't want a divorce. She wanted a 3-year trial separation.
Oh my God.
And then at the end of 3 years, they would see about having a divorce. And if they did divorce, she wanted all the property, all the real estate. She wanted all the stocks, all the bonds, all the cash, and all the cars.
Wow.
And Princess said, "Well, what do I get?" And she said, "You get your freedom."
I was about to say, oh, yeah.
Yeah, Princess, his wife's name was Helene, but he never spelled out her name in letters. He only referred to her as H in the
Wow.
letters, which I think psychologically is interesting. That he couldn't bear to spell out her name or something,
Right.
or maybe he thought that LaDell couldn't bear to see her name
It's like,
spelled out. But he referred to his wife as H, and he never spelled out the word hell. in his letters either. He always
Okay.
used the letter H. And so when you read the letters, you have to
What does he
pay close
mean?
attention to the context
Yes,
to determine whether
exactly.
he's referring to his wife or to hell. And sometimes it's
Emmy,
not easy to determine which it is.
and it makes you wonder. I mean, okay, she was like, I'm gonna make the price tag on this divorce so gigantic that you're
Mm.
gonna think twice about doing it.
Right, and so Princess had a tough time getting anywhere with the divorce. He wrote to LaDell and he said, well, every time I bring up the subject, we have to start from square one. And also, he's a busy man. He's a workaholic. He
Okay.
travels a lot, and when he's not traveling on business, he's going on hunting trips and fishing trips, and
Okay.
he's going to ball games. And LaDell's just going nuts, of course.
I mean,
It's
she's
just like,
sitting, I
can't you
imagine, at
skip the
home.
fishing trip,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
get a divorce? Um, and and so they have something of a row in their correspondence in September. He suggests that maybe he could break away and come down to Memphis for a couple of days for a weekend, and they could meet up at a hotel. And LaDell just explodes.
Yeah.
So I'm not meeting you at any hotel. What do
Right.
you
Yeah.
think I am?
Because,
And she said, I will come to see you, and we will sit in the lobby for 20 minutes, and that is it. And he wrote her back and he said, I don't think so. I don't think you can do that to yourself, much less to me.
it's like, okay. Yeah, but she's not stupid. She's thinking, you know what? We just went from having an affair where you're talking about you're going to get a divorce from your wife, and now I'm seeing you're going to try to slip me into the role of mistress, kind
Right.
of, in between the fishing
Yeah.
and the hunting trips and your work.
Yeah. But but then she ended up giving in and saying, "Oh, well, yeah, I will come. I'm sorry. I'm being silly. I know you love me." And but then something came up and he couldn't come down. So actually, they never saw each other again after
Oh,
July. One of the things that they talked about in their correspondence was how they would be together on Christmas.
okay.
They would be together. He would be free by the holidays, and he would come south, and he would be in Monticello. And so they would spend Christmas together. Well, as things turned out, he wrote her a letter in early December telling her that he didn't think he was ever going to be able to leave his wife. He
Wow.
might be able to leave her someday, but for right now, it didn't look like it. It was kind
Right.
of ambiguous. And by the way, he hadn't had time to pick up anything to send her for Christmas, so he thought he might send her some cash.
Wow.
So, real romantic.
Yeah, I was gonna say that you could tell that romance is cooling a lot.
And then he went on in the letter to complain about how he'd been to the dentist that week and how horrible that was.
Yeah, it's like,
Um, and he said, and I don't know whether I'll be able to write you anytime in New York City or in business. I'm gonna be really busy. And
wow.
then there's silence. And she wrote to her friends, her confidants, and each one of them wrote her back. And they didn't know how to comfort her. They were ill-equipped.
Right.
Her one friend, Frances, in New England, merely said, I was afraid something like this was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and a friend of hers in Helena, Arkansas, who is actually Princess's half-sister, um, wrote to her and said, well, if things don't work out between you and Princess, I hope we can still be friends.
Oh,
Not a
it's
lot of
like,
comfort
okay.
there. And
Like I
then
can
her
see
third
what's coming up on the horizon.
yeah, and then her third confidant was a woman in Hot Springs. Um, and this woman was kind of an odd woman. She was teaching LaDell about Christian Science. LaDell went to the Presbyterian Church, put on a
Okay.
very conservative, conventional facade, but was
Mm-hmm.
interested in all sorts of things like astrology and
Oh,
Christian Science. Of course, she couldn't tell anybody she had these interests, but she had them very
right.
profoundly. And this woman Marie in Hot Springs, her response to LaDell saying, "I haven't heard from Prentice. I don't know what this last letter means. He kind of says he's not going to leave his wife, but he leaves it
Right.
open that he will, just not right now. And Marie wrote back and basically said, quit feeling sorry for yourself. Just have faith. And Merry Christmas, and enclosed a Christmas card. And said, I hope the new year is the best year of your life.
Oh,
And
wow.
that's the last letter of those 83 letters.
Yes.
And that was just before Christmas. On Christmas Eve, LaDell went to the post office, where she had a post office box. Again, as far as I know or anybody knows, again, there was no letter from Prentice. She often would take her mail to the pharmacy down the street, and she would sit and she would drink coffee and read her letters and maybe write responses while she sat
Mm-hmm.
there in the pharmacy drinking coffee. Or on Christmas Eve, she went to the pharmacy, and she didn't sit and drink coffee. She asked the pharmacist for mercury cyanide tablets, which were
Oh,
sold over the
wow.
counter in 1948. It was a common treatment for topical skin sores.
Oh my. So she was already thinking along those lines, that premeditation part as to.
Yeah, yeah. And then the next night, her mother has her annual Christmas party, and I think LaDell was waiting to see whether Prentice would show up and surprise her, because he had always said that he would be with her on Christmas. And then as Christmas Day ended and
Right.
Prentice was nowhere to be seen, she decided to go ahead and take the drastic measure she had planned for her, and went up to the master bedroom suite, which was her bedroom, and took the mercury cyanide.
And when this occurred, I imagine the only ones that knew about her affair with Prentice were the confidants. Her family had no idea what
Hmm.
was going on.
Not at the time, apparently not. The confidants knew. I've always wondered. I have talked to an elderly lady who was the daughter-in-law of the confidant in Helena, Arkansas.
Okay.
And that woman died in 1966. The confidant died in
Mm-hmm.
1966, and this elderly lady who was her daughter-in-law said that her friend, on several occasions, talked about LaDell Allen and what a good friend LaDell had been, but in all the years that she knew um, the confidant, who was also Princess's half sister, remember,
Right.
the woman never let on that LaDell and her brother had had an affair.
Wow. Well, she know how to keep her.
And yeah, and of course there wasn't anything to be gained by revealing that. I
Right.
mean, it
Exactly.
would only mean trouble for her brother.
Right.
So she and he stayed married to her for the rest of his life. He
I
lived
was about to
another
say he never
30
ever got
years.
divorced from her, right?
No, he never got divorced from his wife. There was, I really think that he saw no reason to divorce his wife after Liddell killed herself. He was a practical man. There was no reason for
Wow.
him to divorce his wife after
But
Liddell killed herself.
but let me tell you something though. She was pretty savage there, or she really knew him really well, and said, you know
Hmm.
what? All I have to say is I want to take all your money, which is what you used to go to your hunting and all these fishing trips, and
Hmm.
then what? Maybe she
Yeah.
knew him pretty well. That's
Yeah.
but still, that's kind of like I'm gonna blackmail you into staying married.
Hmm.
And I know back
Yeah.
then, I believe also when people got divorced, you could what was it that you named a person as
Hmm.
basically as a defendant?
Oh, well, Prentice was terrified of scandal.
Ah, there we go.
This is 1948. He's a
Yes.
prominent citizen. This is the Midwest, Minnesota, and of course Liddell's in the Deep South.
Mm-hmm.
So this would have been front page news at that time.
Yes.
for it to be revealed that he had had an affair. And so Prentice was very concerned about his wife or anybody finding out
Mm-hmm.
about the affair. And so there
Right.
wasn't any possible way that he was going to tell his wife that, well, I've met somebody else, I'm in love with this woman, and I want to leave you so I can be with her. That wasn't going to
Right.
happen.
Yeah. I'm sure she probably threw in there. Maybe he didn't put in his letter. Besides the, I'm going to take your money. It was like, oh, and by the way, I'm gonna make sure to create a big scandal and name this lady, whoever she is, as a defendant, and
hmm
I'm gonna ruin everybody's reputation except
Yeah,
mine because I'll be the martyr because you're divorcing me for another woman.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Something clearly happened over Thanksgiving, in 1948,
okay,
because Princess's letters, the few that he wrote after Thanksgiving, are very morose, very dark.
okay,
So his wife said something over the Thanksgiving holiday
yeah, yeah,
that really spooked him,
yep, I
that
bet.
really got him scared.
Yeah, probably she had, like you said, she probably got around to actually talking to an attorney and told him, oh, by the way,
hmm
this is the outcome. So, and Mark, so here she is, she commits suicide, and I imagine her family must have been like, what happened? Especially
hmm
like at her mom's party. I mean, the holidays, it's like, talk about, even though you hear a lot of people getting depressed and doing things like this in the holidays, I'm imagining
Yeah.
at least initially that her family had no clue as to why she would have done this.
No, no, and of course the newspaper, her obituary was on the front page of the local newspaper, but
Wow.
it said nothing about suicide.
Oh,
There was no
no?
hint. No, no, because this is 1948. She's a prominent citizen. It didn't
So,
even mention that she was divorced.
so what did
So
she supposedly die of suddenly, I
I
guess?
didn't say. It didn't say. It just said that
Oh, it didn't?
it just said she died.
Wow.
She
Okay.
just passed away, and it said that she had lived in Monticello all her life, which wasn't true. Because she had lived in Texas and she had lived in Memphis for several
Okay.
years, but the newspaper obituary just said that she passed away. She had lived in Monticello all of her life. She was much loved by family and friends,
Right.
and that was pretty much it.
Except the most obvious, which is what everybody was asking, like, what happened? Because she was relatively a
Yeah,
young woman as far as
everybody
get dying. So,
everybody knew she killed herself. I mean, the death certificate says suicide,
so yeah.
mercury cyanide poisoning, and
Right.
so the doctor knew, and the doctor didn't lie about it. So word was around. I've talked to elderly people who said, "Oh yeah, yeah, everybody knew she killed herself." I mean,
But nobody knew why. I
there
take
was
it.
never nobody. There was never an official statement that she killed herself, or a public official statement at least.
Right.
But everybody knew she killed herself. Nobody knew why though.
Okay. That's the thing that I'm thinking that, and also, of course, the reason why she hid those letters,
hmm
because and it's almost like, yeah, I'm going to kill myself and I'm despondent, but at the same time, I don't want my family to know about this affair I had with a married man.
Right.
Wow.
But you could have destroyed the letters too.
Yeah.
There were four working fireplaces in the house that
Yes.
December, and it was a cold December. And so it would have been easy enough. She had a fireplace in a room. It would have been easy
Right.
enough for her to retrieve the letters from under the floor in the attic and slip downstairs to her room and toss them in the fire. But she didn't. I think and it's not like she killed herself from the spur of the moment. She planned it out.
Right. Exactly. That's what I was
So I think
thinking.
she left. I think she deliberately left the letters. I think she wanted somebody someday to know who she really was and what was
And what
truly
happened?
important to her. Yeah.
So, and then how longer after that did her family live there? Because they imagine those.
Well, her mother passed away in 1954,
Okay.
and her older sister passed away in 1955, and that
Wow.
was the end of the line. The house was inherited by her older sister's only son, Carl Leidinger Jr., who was a physician in Springfield, Missouri. He hired a property manager and turned the house into apartments.
Because I was about to ask you, was this around the time also that it was divvied up and made into apartments?
Yeah, and that's when this ghost story started because the tenants started
Okay.
leaving quickly. Yeah.
Okay, there you go. Right, exactly. That's
Yeah, so there are all
interesting.
these stories about people, moving in and then not staying very long, and the property manager had a hard time renting rooms and keeping tenants because people would get scared by one thing or another. There's a novel, a Gothic romance novel that was published in 1966 by Carolyn Wilson, and Carolyn Wilson lived in the house
Oh,
in the late
wow.
50s when she was a newlywed. And her experience living in the house inspired this 1966 Gothic romance novel. I met Carolyn a few months before she passed away, and she said that the whole time she lived in the house as a newlywed, she felt watched a lot, and she felt
What?
that somebody resented her. And it was that sense of being watched and that sense of being resented that really made her want to write this kind of creepy Gothic romance novel set in a
Wow.
house that's obviously modeled on the Allen house.
Okay. Isn't that interesting?
Mm.
Now, and I guess, I mean, how long was it apartments for? Was that for a few years or what?
It was apartments for 30 years,
That's a pretty long time. That's a lot of people coming and
to
going.
the mid 1980s until Carl Leidinger passed away,
Okay.
and his widow decided that it was time to sell that house. And,
Okay.
he had promised his grandmother, Caddy, that he would keep the house in the Allen family. So it was actually in the Allen family for 80 years until
Okay.
1986.
Because I'm thinking to myself,
Um,
okay, you understand. I mean, LaDell is being the ghost, absolutely, and then her family's been there. Did you ever find out if during those 30 years there had been other deaths there?
in the house,
And I know sometimes it's difficult to do that,
yeah,
especially from renters.
yeah. I'm not aware of any other deaths in the house. Now the funerals were all in the house. LaDell's funeral was at the house.
Wow.
Her son's funeral was at the house before hers. Her
Wow.
mother's funeral was at the house in 1954, and her sister's funeral was at the house in 1955. They had the funerals in the dining room.
You know what? We forget about that. That people used to be born and die and have their funerals at home. It's not like it
Hmm.
is now.
Yeah, when Jolie Allen died in 1917, his banker friends went to Collins where he'd had a heart attack and brought his body back to the house and carried him
Wow.
in and put him on the dining room table.
Oh my God. And it's like, yeah, we become so like if something like that happened nowadays, we'd be like, huh?
Yeah.
But because and the reason why I'm asking is like you said all these EVPs that you hear, you've caught children's voices and all these other distinct voices. And I was thinking, I wonder if any of these were from any of the people that lived there afterwards during those years.
Well, no, not afterward. I mean, the voices, again, you have LaDell, you got her
Okay.
father, you've got Alan Bonner, her son. The children's voices probably come from an earlier time. The
Mm.
original building on the property was a boarding school.
It was. Oh.
1857. It was a girls' boarding school.
Oh.
It was converted into a hospital during the Civil War,
Oh
and then
no.
after the Civil War, it was converted back into a boarding school, and then it became a coeducational school. The Allens had a school, used the building as a school in the early 20th century. So for a good 50 to 60 years at least, you had a school on the property,
You know
and
what?
it
I
was
don't know
in most of those
why.
years it was a boarding school.
You know what? I just thought, I don't know where I got the idea that they were like the first family. In other words, that the occupancy was from only Liddell's family. But God, with that history, no wonder.
Yeah, you got the school, and it was on the back of the property, and the house was built in 1906 in front of the school.
Wow. No, oh yeah. Oh, absolutely, yes. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense as far as the children's voices and
Well, there was a when we bought the property, I went out to the carriage house and I found a tombstone, a child's tombstone in the wall of the carriage house.
oh my God.
So,
Oh,
Houston Meredith, born in 1895 and died in 1900.
oh my. Gee, that's
Talk about creepy.
yes, really. I mean, makes you wonder. You got some burials there on your grounds that you don't know about.
Yeah, so it's a tombstone that predates the construction of the house, the main house.
Yeah, that
Um,
is wow. There's a lot of God knows, and that's the thing. Sometimes things got recorded, but a lot of times events like that earlier as you go back, it's kind of sketchy. Just like what you just described when her obituary, it was
mhm.
printed, but they omit the kind of the centerpiece of the whole thing was what happened to her.
Right, yeah. Well, you don't talk about these things.
Right,
Not
exactly.
1948. Not in a small town in the South.
Yeah. It's
Just like
like,
LaDell is fascinated with astrology, and she wrote to Prentice about his astrological sign and his horoscope all the time. And he just kind of went along with it. You could tell he didn't take it
well,
too
to
seriously.
him back, especially
But
if this guy's what was it? He was a businessman. He's
yeah,
okay, whatever.
he
That
was
make you
not a
happy, okay?
literary fellow or into
Yeah, yeah. He's
paranormal
like,
or the arts or anything like that.
but and how long? How long? When did he die?
He died in 1978.
So he lived quite a few years after she'd passed away.
30 years, yeah. He lived another 30 years.
Wow. You know what? And I imagine you can't be. I imagine he had to have known that this was probably due to what happened between or didn't happen between them as to why she committed suicide. Did he ever find out? I imagine somebody considering that her one of her confidants
Hmm.
was tied to him by family let on like did you hear what happened to LaDell?
Um, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, until I found those letters, I mean, I had never, no, nobody had ever suggested that she had had an affair in 1948, and that was
Right.
the reason for her suicide. But as I said there are all these different theories. The one
Mhm.
that came closest was the theory about the soldier boyfriend who left her in 1945.
And Mark, after you found those letters, did anything change as far as what you were experiencing in the house? Did it quiet down? Did it become amplified?
No, everybody always asks that, and no, Liddell's still there. I mean, everybody's
Okay.
still there. Uh, I think Liddell just wanted her story told.
Okay.
Something
Acknowledgement.
interesting that
Right.
my wife and I discovered the day after I found the letters. We were doing some research from the internet to find out everything that we could about all the different people mentioned in the letters,
Mhm.
and the name Martha Jones came up on the internet. Martha was Liddell's niece, the
Right.
one that I was very close with. This Liddell would go out to see her every month, or Martha would come down to Monticello and see Aunt Liddell. Martha was the one person still alive in 2009 who'd had any kind of relationship with Liddell, who
Okay.
remembered Liddell, and Martha had just died that week.
Martha had just
So
Did you say Martha had just died?
yeah, she just died that week. That she died like 2 days before I found the letters.
Oh my God, Mark, you can't think that that's a coincidence.
No, I think it explains the timing.
Yes, of course.
Martha was gone. She was the last person who remembered Liddell. Um, there was no one left.
Yeah,
It was time.
that
And I woke up that
is
Saturday morning and I was led to those letters.
right because according to what you're saying, you had already been living there a couple of years. So
Hmm.
that timing absolutely had there was a specific meaning as to why you felt that irresistible urge at that point in time to go
Yeah.
up there and go exploring.
Yeah, and I knew the day I found the letters, I knew, okay, well, I'm gonna have to write a book now. You know,
Well,
it
God,
wasn't like the first book I'd written. I'd written several books. I won the Faulkner Award for fiction back in '96. I won other national awards for fiction, but I knew that I was going to have to write a book now that I found those letters, and it was not going to be fiction.
well, no, I was thinking, yeah, this is not fiction, and I mean, and it's not even like this is like letters. This is what straight from the horse's mouth. In other words, as to
Yeah,
the whole exchange of, even though it was what a few months only, or what a year, whatever, that it's like how this thing started, and wow, and it
yeah.
explains a lot as far as. And so after all of this, you've what you just you all coexist. Everything is good in the house.
Yeah, yeah, we've never been frightened by anything. It's
Okay,
just awe-inspiring. Everyone, and we don't wait for things to happen. We don't look for
right.
things to happen. Every once in a while, something will happen, though, and we'll be reminded that we're not alone.
Okay.
um, sometimes, things, are a little startling, but nothing scary. We certainly don't feel there's any animosity.
Well, considering what happened that time that first investigation, that a tree fell down.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah, I think you guys are good there because it's like obviously if they had a problem with your family being there, so, something would have happened, something drastic, like I don't know
yeah.
what.
Yeah,
So,
I have a guy who comes over to the house and does work for me every once in a while. He's a carpenter, and
hmm,
he recreates some of the architectural details of the house
okay,
when things fall apart. And he a couple of times now in over the last several years he's had to get up in high places in the house to do some
hmm,
work, and he's had some close calls. And he has told me that he felt somebody pull him back on both occasions.
wow,
He said, "I always like working at your house because you always got somebody who saves me."
that's a neat story. It's almost like. Yeah, like it's like okay, you're good, you're here, you're helping the family and you're taking care of the house. So it's all good.
Hmm. Yeah,
That is what a great story. Well, Mark, thank you so very much for sharing that story. Everything. It's
my
incredible.
pleasure.
Especially when you come from the point of what you were talking about where you were a total disbeliever. All you really was this house, you wanted the house,
Yeah,
and you were being the skeptic right up to the last moment and then uh like if that wasn't enough, you find those letters. That's
yeah,
incredible. What a story. Well, you know what? Well, LaDell, she's got good company, I guess. She's happy there.
yeah.
And that's what the one thing that you hope that, a person like that, because she sounds like she really went through a lot of unhappy moments
Hmm.
or events in her life, that she's at peace now. And
Yeah, and I think that I like to think that I've done justice in my portrayal of her in my books,
mm-hmm,
in the nonfiction A Haunted Love Story, and also in the novel Ghost Walking, which is fiction, but it has a lot of history and a lot of facts in it, and it's told from LaDell's perspective. She's a ghost, and she's reflecting on what might be the purpose of her death and what maybe was the purpose of her life.
exactly.
And I'd like to think that I've portrayed her as the likable, intelligent, very complex, and very identifiable human being that she was. I think there's something really universal about her in a way, because she had this public life, this facade that she put on that was respectable in the eyes of society,
Sure.
and then she had this private life,
Yeah.
and it was the private life and the components of it that were most important to her.
Sure. And then, yeah, and people don't realize, like you said, this was back in the 1940s, and her family and everything. Certain conduct was expected, and the last thing you
Hmm.
wanted was scandal. And I imagine even then, even if let's say he would have divorced and married her, that still would have been scandalous. Um,
Yeah, it was bad enough that she was a divorcee. She even referred to being subjected to what she called the acid test. She felt that people were always dipping her in acid,
Yeah.
all because she was divorced.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what? A lot of people don't realize that back in those years, yeah, a divorce was like, yeah, you kind of, especially as a woman, it
Yeah.
followed you
What did she
around.
do
In other words,
wrong?
it wasn't easily forgotten or overlooked or things like that.
She couldn't
S-
keep her man.
Yeah,
You know,
I
no,
mean,
he was a womanizer and a drinker, and he couldn't keep a job, but it was her fault. you
right,
know.
and and people don't realize that back then the norms, especially if you came from a family had some type of reputation in a smaller town, it was like,
Hmm.
yeah, we're so far removed sometimes from what was expected of, people's conduct
Oh
that,
yeah.
yeah, but she was willing, God knows when you want to be happy, you want to be happy. But, and you know what I'm thinking, Mark? She probably, when you moved in there, she rubbed her hands together. She goes, I've got a writer. Great.
Hmm.
I love this. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm sure she was like trying to push the prior owner out the door, like, get your stuff and go, get your stuff and go. I got to get this writer in here quick.
Yeah.
Okay, Mark, thank you again so much. It has been
Well, thank
absolutely
you.
wonderful to talk to you and to listen to LaDell's story. And it's been fantastic. It has been
It's been my
absolutely
pleasure.
fantastic. Take care.
Okay, you too.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Oh, wow, guys. I don't know about you, but man, that story is, and it's true. I mean, we see this sometimes on a movie, and we're like, wow, it's really nice and sweet. And I'm going to tell you something. For all those non-believers, even though I know a lot, I got a lot of true believers out there. You know what? But if, like I said, when you're involved with this work, unless you've had personal experiences, but you always have that doubt, like how much of this is real, especially with a lot of the reality TV shows that they make things over the top. That after a while, it's good entertainment, but it's like, yeah, okay, how real is this? And when you hear this story, which I had heard about from before, because it's been featured on other paranormal shows, you ask yourself, um, that it is absolutely true. Okay, as far as people that have questions about what happens to us after we're dead, um, would Liddell's spirit still be there? She hadn't committed suicide. Is this she's there now because she wants to be? But was she there initially because she was so unhappy that she killed herself? She sounds like, despite coming from an affluent background and uh, from a good family, she sounds like I told him, she didn't sound like she was lucky in love. She lost a child. She had lost a sister in the same year, and maybe she was hoping that this affair that was she was hoping was going to turn into a marriage was maybe this was her last chance at being happy, of having her own home, of like, okay, I've got the rest of my life. I want to be happy with somebody. And maybe she thought, you know what, I'm willing to risk the scandal that I know is going to come from me having caused a divorce. Because, like I said back then, you could basically name somebody a defendant as the person that was basically bringing in the divorce or the end of the marriage, and it was a big scandal. If you were nobody, who cares? But when you had some standing and your family was known and both of their families were known, yeah. And she was probably thinking, here I'm willing, like she said, she had already been tested, you know. In other words, she's thinking, okay, I know how bad it can be when you get divorced, even though it's not your fault, and you still get it. So I know that after this, I'm really going to be the other woman, even if I am married to him. And she was probably thinking, I was willing to do all of this, but you had this. We had these wonderful moments together, and maybe you were really sincere when you promised that you were like, that's it. I haven't been happy with my wife. I'm going to get a divorce. But when all was said and done, you were not willing to do what I was willing to do to be together with you. In other words, I would be willing to sacrifice, but you wouldn't. So in other words, you loved me, but up to a certain point. Let me tell you, that's got to be really disappointing. And yeah, yeah, and it makes you think that, like I said, maybe she really thought at some point that this was going to be her last chance at happiness. You know, maybe she thought, okay, if this doesn't work out, I just don't want to figure out, what else is in store for me. Even though it was premeditated, makes you wonder what would have happened if she would have like held out for a little bit longer, or let's face it, maybe a part of her, maybe she saw something where she goes, you know what, this man that I thought was going to marry me, at this point, I can tell that if I have any type of relationship with him, it's going to be as his mistress. And let's face it, that probably wasn't acceptable to her. She says, I'm not going to be the mistress. I'm not going to be sneaking around, meeting you on business trips or in these places, and then eventually at some point you're still going to be married, and one day you'll say, that's it, I've had enough of this, and what then I'll really, if anybody ever found out about it. And you know what? Hats off to her confidants, because they did keep her confidence. That was outstanding. Those were good friends. And even though maybe amongst her family they spoke about it as to what had happened. And I'm not kidding. I don't think it's coincidental that Mark and his family, and that he's a writer, and that right after her niece dies is when he is driven to look in there and find those letters. I don't think that it was. And by the way, this thing of having a tree fall and disconnect electricity, let me tell you something, that's pretty scary. Scary in the sense of nothing happened to them, but scary in the sense of, God, that's a lot of manipulation of power, of because like he said, there's no storm, there was nothing to explain why would a tree come crashing down and do exactly what needed to be done. Something that absolutely was going to stop that investigation right then and there, which was no electricity. Come on. Nothing's impossible, but what are the odds on that? Like I say, paranormal sabotage. Yes. For those that says a lot. But anyway, guys, I hope you like this show. I've got a lot of fantastic guests coming on. A lot of fantastic shows. I've got some storytelling shows. I've got interviews. I might have some field investigations as they pop up. I'm super busy. A lot of people have asked me to do live streams on YouTube, especially having to do with hypnosis, alternative areas of hypnosis, as far as when it comes to past life regressions, also recovering memories from alien abductions, bunch of stuff. I'm going to do shows about that. And my true believers, go to MiamiGhostChronicles.com, go to the Submit Your Story tab, and let me hear your story. Catch me Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I live stream. I try to live stream. I've been really busy. Like when stuff like what I told you about, when the power goes out, there's an outage on 3 days ago in my area, and it's out for like 4 or 5 hours. I don't know what happened. And like I said, I live in a 100-year-old farmhouse, and we get water from a well that's on the property. And guess what? It comes in, it's pumped. No, in other words, it's not when you have your water connected to county or city where it doesn't matter if the electricity goes out, you're still going to have water. Surprise! When that power came back on and turned the faucet, no water. And we ended up having to do a new well just because we couldn't figure out. That was another thing. We couldn't find where the old well was. We had another well on the property, which was used at once upon a time for some type of orchard and stuff. But where we thought the old original well was, because let's face it, when you go looking for a well, it wasn't. We couldn't find it. I was like, okay, so where's this well? So we ended up getting a new well. So anyway, the point being that sometimes life gets in the way of your best laid plans. So Guys, thank you again so very, very much. If you're catching me on YouTube or on podcast forms, which of course are on, you can find me on Spreaker, iHeartRadio, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify. I'm there. Thank you again and for spending this time with me. And if you have any suggestions for shows or material or people that you would like to have on the show, please send me an email. Send me an email at marlene@miamighostchronicles.com. Take care, guys.